The clock on the chapel wall struck 11, and Alexander Whitmore felt his chest tighten as the sound echoed through the empty room. He sat in his wheelchair at the front of the chapel, dressed in a black suit that had been tailored for a wedding he was beginning to believe would never happen. Rows of polished wooden benches stretched behind him, and every single one of them was empty. Not one guest, not one member of his family. Not one friend from the life he used to live before the accident took the use of his legs. He had sent out 120 invitations. Only 2 people had come. His cousin Edward sat quietly a few rows back, his hands folded, his face tight with anger he was trying to hide. Beside him sat Margaret, the housekeeper who had worked for the Whitmore family for over 20 years, her eyes red from crying earlier that morning. Alexander stared at the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chapel. Any minute now, he expected them to stay shut. He expected silence. He expected the woman he loved to finally understand what everyone else in his life already believed, that marrying a man in a wheelchair, a man who could no longer stand at his own wedding, a man whose own family had abandoned him, was a mistake she would come to regret. 3 years earlier, Alexander had been a different man. He had walked into rooms with confidence. He had ridden horses across the family estate every morning before breakfast. He had been the pride of the Whitmore name, the future Duke, the man everyone expected great things from. Then, on a rainy night in late autumn, a car crash on a narrow country road changed everything in a single moment. He remembered very little of the crash itself, only the sound of metal bending and the feeling of being unable to move his legs when he woke up in the hospital 3 days later. The doctors told him the damage to his spine was permanent. He would never walk again. He remembered the silence in the hospital room after they said those words, how his mother had turned away and quietly left, how his father had simply nodded and said very little, as if his son had already become someone else, someone less important, someone who could no longer carry the family name the way a duke was supposed to. In the months that followed, Alexander watched his old life disappear piece by piece. Friends stopped calling. Invitations to social events stopped arriving. Distant relatives who once fought for his attention now avoided him entirely, as if his condition might somehow affect them too. He became bitter, quiet, and difficult to be around, pushing away anyone who tried to get close, certain that pity was the only thing anyone felt for him now. It was during those dark months that Eleanor Marsh entered his life. She was not a noblewoman. She was not from a wealthy family. She was a physiotherapist assigned to help him regain whatever strength and independence he could after the accident. On her first day working with him, Alexander had been cold and short-tempered, telling her he did not need her help and did not want it. Eleanor had simply smiled, set down her equipment, and said that she was not there because he wanted her there. She was there because it was her job, and she intended to do it well whether he liked it or not. Something about her refusal to be pushed away caught his attention. She did not treat him like a broken man. She did not lower her voice or speak to him with the careful, delicate tone that everyone else used, as if he might shatter at the slightest disagreement. She argued with him. She teased him when he complained too much during his exercises. She told him honestly when she thought he was giving up too easily, and she told him honestly when she thought he was pushing himself too hard. Weeks turned into months, and Alexander found himself looking forward to her visits more than he wanted to admit. He began to notice small things about her, the way she hummed quietly to herself while setting up equipment, the way she always brought a cup of tea for herself and one for him, even though he rarely drank it, the way she never once asked about his family's title or his inheritance or his estate, because she did not know about any of it. To Eleanor, he was simply Alexander, a man working hard to rebuild his strength, not a duke, not an heir, not a broken symbol of a great family name. It took him nearly a year to tell her the truth about who he really was. He remembered how nervous he had felt admitting it, half expecting her expression to change, half expecting her to suddenly treat him differently now that she knew his family owned half the county. Instead, Eleanor had laughed and said that explained why he was so stubborn, since apparently he had been raised believing the world owed him whatever he wanted. He had laughed too, for the first time in longer than he could remember, and in that moment, sitting across from her in the small physiotherapy room with sunlight coming through the window, he realized he had fallen in love with a woman who had never once cared about anything except who he truly was. Now, sitting in the empty chapel with the wedding march about to begin, Alexander could not stop the fear creeping into his chest. He had proposed to Alina 6 months earlier, in the garden behind the estate, on a bench where they had spent countless afternoons talking. He remembered how his hands had shaken as he asked her, certain she would say no, certain that no woman in her right mind would choose a life bound to a wheelchair and a family that had already made their feelings about him clear. She had said yes without a single moment of hesitation. But saying yes in a quiet garden was different from standing in front of an empty chapel on the day itself, different from facing the reality of what marrying him actually meant. His family had made it clear they would not attend. His mother had sent a short letter explaining that she could not bring herself to watch her son marry beneath his station, while also unable to properly stand beside his bride. His father had said nothing at all, which somehow felt worse than any cruel words could have been. Cousins, aunts, uncles, childhood friends, all of them had found reasons to stay away, citing prior engagements or health concerns, or simply not responding to the invitation at all. Even Alina's own family had expressed concern, though not out of cruelty. Her mother, a kind but practical woman named Grace, had sat her daughter down weeks before the wedding and asked her gently whether she understood what she was choosing, a life where she would likely never be fully accepted by her husband's world, a life that would require enormous strength and patience. Alina had told her mother that she understood completely, and that she had never wanted a life without challenges, only a life with someone who was honest and kind and worth fighting for. As the minutes ticked by in the silent chapel, Alexander glanced toward Edward, who offered a small, encouraging nod, though his eyes betrayed his own uncertainty. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, whispering something under her breath that sounded like a prayer. The organist, an elderly man named Mr. Coleridge who had played for the Whitmore family for decades, sat quietly at his instrument, unsure whether to begin playing or wait for some signal that never seemed to come. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, bracing himself for what he was certain would happen next. He pictured Alina changing her mind at the last second, perhaps sitting in a car outside the chapel right now, finally understanding the weight of what she was about to commit to, finally deciding that a life of empty pews and family rejection was too much to carry, even for love. He thought about calling off the wedding himself, sparing her the difficult choice, sparing himself the humiliation of waiting for an answer that might never come. His hand moved toward the wheels of his chair, ready to turn and leave before anyone could see the look on his face if she truly did not walk through those doors. But before he could move, a sound broke the silence. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the chapel groaned as they began to open. Alexander's heart pounded so loudly he was certain everyone in the room could hear it. He turned his chair slightly, his eyes fixed on the entrance, bracing himself for whatever was about to appear. For a moment nothing happened. The doors stood open, revealing bright daylight outside, but no one stepped through. Alexander's stomach twisted, certain now that even this had been some cruel trick of the wind, some final disappointment before the day was over completely. He looked away, unable to keep watching, unable to keep hopping. And then he heard footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate footsteps echoing against the stone floor of the empty chapel. He turned back toward the doors, and his breath caught in his throat. There, standing at the entrance, dressed in a simple white gown with no veil, no bridesmaids, no father to walk her down the aisle, stood Alina Marsh. She was completely alone. Her family, delayed by an unexpected snowstorm on the roads outside the county, had not yet arrived. There was no music playing, no crowd standing to admire her, No grand entrance the way weddings were supposed to look in the world Alexander had grown up in. But none of that seemed to matter, because Alina was smiling. It was not a nervous smile, not the kind of smile people wore when they were trying to hide their fear or their doubt. It was wide and genuine and completely unshaken, the same smile she gave him every single day in the physiotherapy room when he managed even the smallest bit of progress, the same smile that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. She began to walk down the aisle by herself, past the rows and rows of empty benches, her eyes never leaving his. Alexander felt tears building behind his eyes, though he fought hard to hold them back. He had spent so many months preparing himself for disappointment, for rejection, for the confirmation that he was somehow less worthy of love because of the chair he now depended on, that he had never truly allowed himself to imagine this moment, the moment where none of that mattered at all. As Alina reached the front of the chapel, she stopped directly in front of him. The empty seats around them seemed to fade away entirely, as if the whole world had narrowed down to just the two of them standing, or rather one standing and one seated, in a chapel that suddenly did not feel empty at all. She reached down and took his hand in both of hers, her smile never wavering, and Alexander finally understood something he had been too afraid to believe until this exact moment. The people who had refused to come, the family who had turned their backs, the friends who had disappeared the moment his life became difficult, none of them had ever truly mattered as much as he thought they did. What mattered was standing right in front of him, smiling, having walked through those doors entirely on her own, needing no one else's approval to prove that this love was real. 6 months before that morning in the chapel, Alina sat across the kitchen table from her mother, staring down at a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Grace Marsh had asked her the same question 3 times already, though each time she phrased it a little differently, trying to find an angle that might finally get through to her daughter. Grace was not a cruel woman, and she was not opposed to her daughter finding happiness. She simply understood, in a way that Alina perhaps did not yet fully grasp, what it meant to marry into a world that had never wanted people like them in it. Grace had grown up in a small village not far from the Whitmore estate, and she remembered the way the wealthy families in the region treated everyone outside their circle, with polite smiles that never quite reached their eyes, with invitations that were sent out of obligation rather than genuine welcome. Alina listened patiently as her mother spoke, but her mind kept drifting back to the day she had first met Alexander, nearly 2 years earlier, in a rehabilitation center that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh linen. She had been assigned to his case somewhat by accident, after the physiotherapist originally scheduled to work with him had fallen ill. Alina remembered walking into the room for the first time and finding a man sitting by the window, staring out at nothing in particular, his expression so hollow and distant that for a moment she wondered if he had even noticed her arrival. She had introduced herself cheerfully, the way she did with every new patient, and he had barely glanced in her direction before informing her, in a flat and tired voice, that he did not require her services and that she should inform whoever had sent her that he wished to be left alone. Alina had encountered difficult patients before, people struggling with anger and grief after losing the use of parts of their bodies they once took for granted, and she recognized immediately that his coldness was not really about her at all. Rather than leaving, as he clearly expected her to do, Alina had pulled a chair over and sat down anyway, setting her equipment bag on the floor beside her. She told him plainly that she understood he was angry, that anyone in his position had every right to feel that way, but that sitting by a window feeling sorry for himself was not going to bring back any strength in his legs, and strength, even partial strength, was something that could still be earned back through hard work. He had turned to look at her then, properly for the first time, with an expression somewhere between annoyance and surprise, as if he was not used to anyone speaking to him so directly. Alina simply smiled and asked him to try lifting his right leg just slightly, even an inch would be progress worth noting. He refused at first, insisting it was pointless, but something in her patient, unwavering expression eventually wore down his resistance, and he tried, managing only the smallest movement before giving up in frustration. It was not much, but Alina celebrated it as though he had run a marathon, and something about her genuine enthusiasm, completely unlike the careful, pitying tone everyone else used around him, cracked through the wall he had built since the accident. Over the following weeks, their sessions became a strange kind of routine neither of them had expected to enjoy. Alexander remained difficult at times, prone to dark moods and sharp words, but Alina never once flinched away from his temper, matching his sharpness with calm patience, and occasionally, a well-timed joke that would catch him so off guard he found himself laughing despite his best efforts to remain miserable. She never asked him about his family, never asked about his life before the accident beyond what was medically relevant to his recovery, and it took Alexander a long time to realize that her lack of curiosity about his background was not indifference but genuine respect for whoever he wanted to be in that room, separate from whatever title or inheritance waited for him outside those walls. Alina, for her part, found herself looking forward to her visits to the rehabilitation center more than she cared to admit to her colleagues. She began noticing small details about Alexander that had nothing to do with his physical recovery. The way his eyes lit up slightly whenever he managed a new exercise, the dry, clever sense of humor that occasionally slipped out when he forgot to be guarded, the surprising gentleness in his voice whenever he spoke about his childhood memories of riding horses across open fields before the accident took that freedom away from him. Months into their sessions, during a particularly difficult exercise that left Alexander exhausted and frustrated, he had finally told her the truth about who he was, that he was not simply a patient recovering from a car accident, but the heir to a dukedom, a man whose family owned significant portions of land across the county, a man who had once been expected to inherit not just wealth but responsibility and influence far beyond what most people ever experienced. Alina remembered blinking at him for a long moment before bursting into laughter, not out of disrespect, but because the revelation somehow explained so much about his stubbornness and his occasional flashes of old-fashioned formality that seemed out of place in a modern rehabilitation center. She had told him that explained why he complained about the tea being served in the wrong kind of cup, and Alexander had laughed too, surprised at how easily she had accepted something that he had expected to change everything between them. It did not change everything. If anything, it changed very little. Alina continued treating him exactly as she always had, refusing to soften her honesty or adjust her expectations simply because he came from wealth and status. If anything, she pushed him harder after learning the truth, telling him bluntly that a man with his resources had no excuse for giving up on his recovery, and that self-pity was a luxury he could not afford if he wanted to prove wrong everyone who assumed his life was now essentially over. Their relationship deepened slowly, built not on dramatic declarations, but on small, steady moments of genuine connection. Alina began staying later than her shifts required, simply to talk with him about books they had both read, or to listen to him describe memories of the estate grounds before everything changed. Alexander began looking forward to those extra minutes more than any part of his day, finding in her presence a kind of peace he had not felt since before the accident. It was nearly a year after their first meeting that Alexander finally admitted, during one of their late afternoon conversations, that he had fallen in love with her. He remembered how nervous he had felt saying the words aloud, certain that once his official recovery was complete and their professional relationship ended, she would simply move on to her next patient and forget about him entirely. Alina had been quiet for a long moment after he spoke, long enough that his heart sank, certain he had made a terrible mistake in speaking so honestly. Then she had smiled, the same wide, genuine smile that would later light up an empty chapel, and told him that she had been waiting for months for him to finally say something, because she had fallen for him long before he worked up the courage to admit his own feelings. Their relationship, once it became something more than physiotherapist and patient, faced immediate challenges. Alina had to be reassigned to a different patient to avoid any conflict of interest at the rehabilitation center, a transition that felt strange after spending so many months focused entirely on Alexander's recovery. More difficult still was introducing Alina to the world Alexander came from, a world that made its disapproval known almost immediately. The first time Alina visited the Whitmore estate, she remembered feeling the weight of judgment the moment she stepped through the front doors. Alexander's mother, a tall, elegant woman named Constance, greeted her with a politeness so carefully controlled it felt almost hostile, asking pointed questions about Alina's family background, her education, her financial situation, questions clearly designed to establish just how far beneath the family's expectations she truly was. Alexander's father said very little during that first visit, observing Alina with an expression she could not quite read, though it certainly did not seem welcoming. Other relatives who happened to be present that day were similarly cool, offering thin smiles and brief conversations before finding excuses to drift away toward other guests. Alina had expected some difficulty, given everything Alexander had told her about his family's traditional views on status and marriage, but the depth of the coldness still caught her off guard. On the drive home that evening, she remembered Alexander apologizing repeatedly for his family's behavior, clearly embarrassed and frustrated, but Alina had simply reached over and taken his hand, telling him that she had not fallen in love with his family, and their approval, while it would have been nice to have, was not something she needed in order to build a life with him. Over the following months, as their relationship grew more serious, the coldness from Alexander's family only intensified. Constance made her disapproval increasingly clear, at one point suggesting to Alexander privately that perhaps Alina was simply drawn to his title and inheritance, a suggestion that made Alexander angrier than Alina had ever seen him. He had defended her fiercely, reminding his mother that Alina had fallen in love with him during a period when he could offer her nothing but bitterness and difficult recovery sessions, long before she ever knew about his title or the family fortune. Despite the growing tension with his family, Alexander's feelings for Alina only deepened, and it was during a quiet afternoon in the estate gardens, sitting on a bench where they had spent countless hours together, that he finally worked up the courage to propose. He remembered his hands trembling as he opened the small box containing a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a ring Constance had reluctantly handed over only after significant pressure from Alexander, making her disapproval of the entire situation abundantly clear even in that small gesture. Alina had said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down her face, and for a brief moment, sitting together in that garden, neither of them worried about empty chapels or absent family members or the judgment of a world that had never fully accepted either of them. They simply existed in that moment, two people who had found something real in each other, regardless of everything standing against them. It was only in the weeks leading up to the wedding that the full weight of his family's rejection became impossible to ignore. Invitations were sent, and one by one, the responses came back with polite excuses or, in many cases, no response at all. Constance's letter, explaining that she could not bring herself to attend, arrived just 2 weeks before the ceremony, and Alexander remembered reading it alone in his study, feeling a familiar hollowness settle into his chest, the same hollowness he had felt in the hospital room 3 years earlier when the doctors first told him he would never walk again. He had considered calling off the wedding more than once during those difficult weeks, not because his feelings for Alina had changed, but because he could not bear the thought of her standing at an altar surrounded by empty seats, publicly confronted with the reality of just how unwelcome she truly was in the world he came from. Each time the thought crossed his mind, though, he remembered her voice, calm and certain, telling him that she had never needed his family's approval, only his honesty and his commitment. So the wedding proceeded, despite everything working against it, built on nothing but the stubborn hope of two people who had found something worth fighting for in each other, even as the world around them made clear just how little support they could expect to receive. That same morning, several hours before she walked through the chapel doors, Alina woke up in her small rented cottage to the sound of wind howling against the windows. She sat up in bed and pulled back the curtain, only to find the world outside covered in a thick blanket of snow that had not been forecast the night before. Her stomach dropped immediately, and she reached for her phone, dialing her mother's number with hands that were already beginning to shake. Grace answered on the second ring, her voice tight with worry. She explained that the roads leading from their village toward the chapel had become impassable overnight, that the local news was already warning drivers to stay off the highways until crews could clear the worst of the ice, and that she, along with Alina's father and younger brother, were currently stranded at home with no realistic way of reaching the ceremony in time. Alina sat on the edge of her bed, listening to her mother apologize over and over, and felt a strange calm settle over her despite the circumstances. She had spent months preparing herself for a wedding where very few people would be present, where the judgment of an entire social class hung over every decision she and Alexander had made together. A snowstorm keeping her own family away felt almost like one more test, one more obstacle designed to see whether her resolve would hold. She told her mother not to worry, that she loved her and understood completely, and that nothing about the storm would change what was about to happen that day. Grace, through tears, told her daughter how proud she was, how she had never seen anyone face such difficulty with the kind of quiet strength Alina had shown over the past year, and how she wished more than anything she could be there to see her walk down the aisle. After ending the call, Alina sat alone in her small bedroom for several minutes, staring at her wedding dress hanging on the back of the closet door. It was a simple gown, nothing extravagant, chosen because it felt like her rather than because it matched any particular tradition or expectation. She had originally planned to have her mother help her get ready that morning, curling her hair and fastening the small buttons along the back of the dress, sharing quiet, nervous conversation the way brides and mothers were supposed to on a wedding day. Instead, Alina found herself alone, carefully doing her own hair in front of a small mirror, her hands steady despite the circumstances. She thought about calling a friend to help, but most of her closest friends lived several hours away and would have faced the same impossible roads. She thought briefly about postponing the ceremony, sending word to the chapel that the wedding would need to wait for better weather, but something about that idea felt wrong to her, felt like giving one more excuse to a world that had already found too many reasons to stay away. She finished dressing alone, fastening the final buttons with some difficulty, twisting her arms behind her back in ways that made her laugh quietly at the absurdity of the situation. Once ready, she stood in front of the mirror and studied her reflection for a long moment. There was no veil, since her mother had been planning to bring the family veil that morning along with the rest of the bridal preparations that never arrived. There were no flowers, since the florist had called earlier to say deliveries throughout the county were delayed because of the storm. None of it seemed to matter as much as she expected it would. Alina took one last look in the mirror, smiled at herself, and reached for her coat, knowing that whatever the day looked like, whatever pieces of tradition might be missing, the only thing that truly mattered was reaching that chapel and standing beside the man she loved. The drive to the chapel took nearly twice as long as usual because of the icy roads, and more than once Alina felt her car slide slightly on a turn, her heart jumping into her throat before the tires found grip again. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her breath fogging the inside of the windshield despite the heater running at full strength, and found herself talking quietly to herself the entire drive, repeating small reassurances that she would make it, that nothing about a little snow was going to stop her from reaching the chapel on time. As she finally turned onto the long private road leading toward the chapel grounds, Eleanor caught her first glimpse of the building itself, its old stone walls looking almost silver under the pale winter sunlight breaking through the clouds. She parked her car outside, sat for a moment gathering herself, and stepped out into the cold morning air. Walking toward the chapel entrance alone, without her father's arm to hold, without bridesmaids trailing behind her, without any of the traditional preparations that usually surrounded a bride on her wedding day, Eleanor felt something unexpected settle over her. Rather than sadness at everything missing, she felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. This day had never truly been about tradition, or approval, or the presence of a crowd validating her choice. It had always simply been about Alexander, and about the promise she intended to make to him regardless of who else showed up to witness it. She reached the heavy wooden doors and paused for a moment, taking a slow breath, steadying herself before pushing them open. As the doors swung inward, revealing the chapel's interior, Eleanor's eyes immediately found Alexander sitting near the front, his expression a mixture of hope and fear so raw it nearly broke her heart from across the room. She stepped inside and began walking, her footsteps the only sound echoing through the otherwise silent chapel. She noticed the empty rows on either side of her, benches that should have been filled with well wishes and cheerful faces, but she refused to let the emptiness weigh on her. Instead, she focused entirely on Alexander, on the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle, and let her smile grow wider with every step she took toward him. Edward, watching from his seat, felt a lump form in his throat as he observed Eleanor's approach. He had known Alexander since childhood, had watched his cousin transform from a confident young man into someone quiet and withdrawn after the accident, and seeing Eleanor walk toward him now, completely unbothered by the absence of a crowd, filled Edward with a fierce kind of respect he had not expected to feel that morning. He found himself standing slightly from his seat, an instinctive gesture of respect, even though there was no formal procession requiring it. Margaret, seated beside Edward, pressed her handkerchief against her mouth to stifle a sob, watching the bride approach with an expression of pure, unshaken joy despite everything working against the day. She had worked for the Whitmore family long enough to remember Alexander as a small child, running through the estate gardens without a care in the world, and seeing him now, waiting nervously for the woman who had chosen to love him regardless of his circumstances, felt like witnessing something far more meaningful than any traditional society wedding she had attended in her many years of service to the family. Mr. Coleridge, sensing the moment building in front of him, finally began playing the wedding march on the old chapel organ, the music swelling softly through the stone room, filling the silence that had hung over the ceremony until that point. The sound seemed to give the moment a kind of grounding, transforming what could have felt like a sad, sparsely attended event into something that finally resembled the wedding it was always meant to be. As Eleanor reached the front of the chapel, she stopped directly in front of Alexander's wheelchair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply looking at each other, taking in the reality that despite every obstacle, despite every person who had chosen to stay away, they had both arrived at exactly this moment together. Eleanor knelt down slightly, bringing herself to eye level with Alexander, a gesture so natural and unself-conscious that it caught everyone in the room off guard. She reached for both of his hands, holding them gently, and Alexander felt the last of his fear finally begin to dissolve, replaced by something warmer, something that felt remarkably like certainty. The officiant, a kind older man named Reverend Hollies, who had agreed to perform the ceremony despite the unusual circumstances, cleared his throat gently, glancing between the two of them with visible emotion in his own expression. He had officiated many weddings throughout his career, grand celebrations filled with hundreds of guests, elaborate flowers and lavish receptions. but he found himself struggling to recall a single ceremony that had moved him as deeply as this one, built on nothing but two empty rows and the unshakable devotion between the couple standing before him. He began the ceremony with the traditional opening words, his voice steady despite the quiet room, acknowledging that marriage was meant to be witnessed and celebrated by loved ones, but that on this particular morning, the true witnesses were not measured by the number of seats filled, but by the depth of commitment standing at the altar. Alexander felt his throat tighten at those words, glancing briefly toward Edward and Margaret, the only two people who had chosen to be present, understanding now more than ever just how much their loyalty meant to him. As the ceremony continued, snow began falling gently outside the chapel windows, visible through the tall stained glass panels lining the walls, casting soft colored light across the empty benches. It felt, to everyone present, like the world itself was acknowledging the significance of the moment, even as it had conspired earlier that morning to keep so many others away. Alina remained kneeling beside Alexander's chair throughout much of the early ceremony, refusing the traditional standing position that would have placed her above him, insisting instead on meeting him exactly where he was, both literally and figuratively. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the entire relationship they had built together, a partnership founded not on traditional expectations, but on genuine equality and mutual respect. As Reverend Hollis prepared to move into the exchange of vows, he paused for a moment, looking between the couple with a warm, knowing smile. He remarked quietly that in all his years performing ceremonies, he had rarely witnessed two people so clearly certain of the choice they were making, regardless of the circumstances surrounding them. Alexander squeezed Alina's hands gently, and Alina smiled back at him, both of them ready, at last, to speak the words that would bind their lives together, regardless of who had chosen to witness it. Reverend Hollis turned first to Alina, inviting her to begin. Alina took a slow breath, her hands still wrapped around Alexander's, and began speaking words she had written herself weeks earlier, though she had memorized them so thoroughly that she barely needed to think about what came next. She told him that when she first met him, she had not known his name meant anything beyond the chart pinned to his hospital door. She had not known about the estate, the title, or the enormous weight of expectation that came with the Whitmore name. She had simply seen a man who was struggling, angry, and afraid, and something in her had refused to walk away from that struggle, even when he pushed her to. She told him that loving him had never been about the man he used to be before the accident, the confident young heir who rode horses across open fields and never doubted his place in the world. She had never known that version of him, and she did not love a memory or an idea of who he once was. She loved the man who fought through exhaustion during physiotherapy sessions, who cried in frustration more than once and kept going anyway, who slowly, painfully, rebuilt not just his physical strength, but his belief that his life still had value and purpose. Alina's voice caught slightly as she continued, telling him that she was not choosing him despite the wheelchair, as if it were some obstacle she had generously agreed to overlook. She was choosing him alongside the wheelchair, alongside every challenge that came with his condition, because those challenges were now simply part of who he was, and she loved all of him, not some edited version that fit more comfortably into the world's expectations. She promised him that she would never treat him as fragile, never speak to him with the careful, pitying tone that so many others used, because she had learned early in their relationship that he needed honesty far more than he needed sympathy. She promised to keep pushing him when he needed pushing, to keep laughing with him during difficult moments, and to keep choosing him every single day, regardless of who else chose to stand beside them or walk away. By the time Alina finished speaking, tears were streaming freely down Alexander's face, and he made no attempt to hide them. Margaret was openly sobbing in her seat, and even Edward, normally composed and reserved, dabbed quickly at his own eyes before anyone could notice. Reverend Hollis turned to Alexander next, asking if he was ready to share his own vows. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, the formal vows he had spent weeks carefully composing with the help of a family solicitor, vows filled with proper language about duty, legacy, and the responsibilities of carrying forward the Whitmore name. He looked down at the paper for a long moment, then, almost without thinking, folded it back up and handed it to Edward, who took it with a confused but understanding expression. Alexander looked back at Alina, took a steadying breath, and began speaking instead from memory, from somewhere far more honest than any prepared speech could ever reach. He told her that in the months after his accident, he had convinced himself that his old life, the version of him that could walk, ride horses, and stand confidently at social gatherings, was the only version of himself worth loving. He had believed that once people saw him in the wheelchair, permanently changed, they would only ever see him as less than he used to be, someone to be pitied rather than admired, someone whose value had somehow diminished along with his ability to walk. He admitted that when Alina first started treating him, he had expected the same pity from her that he received from everyone else, the careful tone, the overly gentle handling, the unspoken assumption that he was now fragile and broken. Instead, she had challenged him, argued with him, refused to let him wallow in self-pity, and somewhere along the way, without either of them fully realizing it at first, she had taught him that his worth had never actually been tied to his ability to walk in the first place. Alexander's voice shook as he continued, telling her that he had spent years terrified of the idea that he would live out the rest of his life being pitied rather than loved, that anyone who chose to stay beside him would do so out of obligation or sympathy rather than genuine desire. He confessed that even in proposing to her, even after months of building a life together, some small part of him had still doubted whether she truly wanted this life, or whether she felt trapped by circumstances beyond her control. He told her that watching her walk through those chapel doors alone that morning, smiling despite the empty seats surrounding her, despite a snowstorm that had stolen her own family from the ceremony, had finally silenced every doubt he had carried for years. No one walks alone into an empty room, facing judgment and absence, unless they are certain, completely and unshakably certain, of the choice they are making. Alexander promised Alina that he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of that certainty, that he would never again allow doubt or self-pity to convince him that his condition made him less deserving of love. He promised to support her fully, to build a life together defined not by what society expected of a duke and his wife, but by the honesty and partnership they had built from the very first day they met in that rehabilitation center. As Alexander finished speaking, the chapel fell into a silence deeper than anything that had preceded the ceremony, a silence filled not with emptiness but with profound emotion. Reverend Hollis, visibly moved himself, took a moment before continuing with the final portion of the ceremony, his voice thick with emotion as he pronounced them husband and wife. The exchange of rings followed, Alexander's hands trembling slightly as he slipped the simple gold band onto Alina's finger, a ring they had chosen together specifically, because it held no connection to family tradition or expectation, simply a symbol of their own choice, made freely and without obligation to anyone else. When Reverend Hollis finally announced that Alexander could kiss his bride, Alina leaned down, meeting him at eye level once again, and the kiss that followed felt to everyone present like the true beginning of everything that had led to this moment. Months of struggle, doubt, rejection, and unwavering determination finally culminating in a single, quiet, powerful gesture of love. Edward and Margaret rose from their seats, applauding despite being only two people in an otherwise empty chapel, their enthusiasm somehow filling the space more completely than a crowd of 100 guests ever could have managed. Mr. Coleridge began playing a joyful recessional on the organ, the music swelling triumphantly through the stone chapel, and for a moment, None of the emptiness surrounding them seemed to matter at all. As Alexander and Alina made their way back down the aisle together, Alina walking slowly beside his wheelchair rather than ahead of him, the chapel doors opened once more, this time revealing a small group of figures rushing in from the cold, brushing snow from their coats. Alina's parents and younger brother had finally managed to navigate the icy roads, arriving just as the ceremony concluded, breathless and apologetic, but present nonetheless. Grace rushed forward, tears streaming down her face, embracing her daughter tightly and apologizing repeatedly for missing the ceremony itself. Alina simply laughed through her own tears, telling her mother that she had made it in time for what truly mattered, being there to celebrate with them now that the vows had already been spoken. Alexander watched the reunion with a quiet, contented smile, understanding fully now that the family gathered around them, though small in number, represented something far more valuable than the crowded, obligatory gatherings that so often defined weddings within his own social class. This small group, gathered together despite snowstorms and disapproving relatives and every obstacle placed in their path, represented genuine love, freely given and completely unconditional. As the small wedding party made their way out of the chapel together, the snow had finally begun to ease outside, pale winter sunlight breaking through the clouds and casting a soft glow across the estate grounds. Alexander looked up at Alina, now officially his wife, and felt, for the first time since the accident 3 years earlier, a complete and unshakable sense of peace about the life ahead of him. News of the wedding spread faster than either Alexander or Alina could have anticipated. A local photographer, hired only to capture a handful of formal portraits after the ceremony, had shared one particular image with a small regional newspaper, a photograph of Alina kneeling beside Alexander's wheelchair at the altar, their hands clasped together, both of them smiling despite the rows of empty benches visible behind them. Within days, the photograph had been picked up by larger publications, and the story behind it, a duke abandoned by his own family on his wedding day, and a bride who walked alone through an empty chapel with nothing but conviction guiding her steps, spread across newspapers and online platforms throughout the country. Some outlets framed the story with sensational curiosity, focusing on the scandal of a prominent noble family refusing to attend such an important event. Others framed it as an inspiring account of love, overcoming prejudice and difficult circumstances. Alexander found the sudden attention deeply uncomfortable at first. He had spent years avoiding public scrutiny since the accident, uncomfortable with the way people looked at him differently once they learned about his condition. And the idea of his private struggles being discussed by strangers across the country left him feeling exposed in ways he had not anticipated. Alina, however, approached the sudden attention with far more calm than he expected, reminding him gently that the truth of their story, difficult as parts of it were, was nothing to be ashamed of. A journalist named Claire Bennett, writing for a well-respected national publication, reached out requesting an interview, promising a fair and thoughtful piece rather than the more sensational coverage that had characterized some of the earlier reporting. After much discussion, Alexander and Alina agreed to speak with her, cautiously at first, though Claire's genuine curiosity and respectful approach quickly put them both at ease. During the interview, conducted in the quiet study of the Whitmore estate, Alexander spoke openly for the first time about the isolation he had experienced following his accident, the friends who disappeared, the family members who treated him differently once his condition became permanent, the deep insecurity he had carried for years about whether he could ever be loved for who he was rather than pitied for what he had lost. Alina spoke about their meeting in the rehabilitation center, about the months of building trust and connection long before either of them understood where their relationship might lead, and about her unwavering belief that love should never be conditional on someone's physical circumstances. The article, when it finally published, resonated with readers far beyond what either of them expected. Letters and messages began arriving at the estate from people across the country, many of them sharing their own experiences with disability, chronic illness, or family rejection following unexpected life changes. Parents wrote about children who had faced similar isolation after accidents or diagnoses. Couples wrote about navigating relationships where one partner faced significant physical challenges, describing the same fear Alexander had carried, the fear of being loved only out of obligation or pity rather than genuine desire. Alina found herself deeply moved by the response, and within a few months, she began working with a small organization dedicated to supporting relationships and families affected by disability, offering guidance and resources drawn from her professional background as well as her personal experience. She traveled to speak with support groups, sharing her story not as some perfect fairy tale, but as an honest account of the real challenges and real rewards that came with choosing love despite society's expectations. Alexander, meanwhile, found himself reconsidering his own role within the family estate. For years following the accident, various family members had quietly suggested, sometimes directly and sometimes through implication, that perhaps managing the estate's affairs should be handed over to a distant cousin or trusted advisor, someone who could handle the physical demands of the role more easily. Alexander had internalized much of that doubt himself, uncertain whether he could still fulfill the responsibilities expected of him. Inspired partly by Alina's steady confidence in him, and partly by the outpouring of support following their story becoming public, Alexander made the decision to fully reclaim his role managing the estate's affairs. He worked with architects to modify various buildings across the property, ensuring accessibility that had never previously been considered necessary. He began attending meetings with tenant farmers and estate staff personally, rather than allowing decisions to be made on his behalf by others who assumed he preferred to remain removed from daily operations. The transition was not always smooth. Some longtime estate employees, accustomed to the way things had been managed since Alexander's father's era, struggled initially to adjust to his more hands-on approach. There were difficult conversations, moments of frustration on all sides, and a genuine learning curve as everyone involved adjusted to a leadership style shaped by someone determined to prove that his physical limitations did not equate to professional limitations. Slowly, over the course of the following year, Alexander began earning a reputation throughout the county not as the unfortunate heir who had lost the use of his legs, but as a genuinely capable and dedicated steward of the family's lands and responsibilities. Tenant farmers who had initially approached him with hesitant sympathy began speaking with him as they would any respected landowner, discussing practical matters of crop rotation, property maintenance, and community investment without the careful, delicate tone that had once characterized nearly every interaction he had with people outside his immediate circle. As for Alexander's parents, the aftermath of the wedding proved complicated. Constance, upon seeing the widespread public sympathy and admiration directed toward Alina and Alexander following the newspaper coverage, found herself facing an uncomfortable kind of social pressure, entirely different from what she had anticipated when she chose to skip the ceremony. Friends and acquaintances within her own social circle began asking pointed questions about her absence, some with genuine curiosity, others with barely concealed judgment. Several weeks after the wedding, Constance reached out to Alexander, requesting a private meeting at the estate. Alexander agreed cautiously, uncertain what to expect from the conversation. When his mother arrived, she seemed notably less composed than her usual carefully maintained public persona, admitting, with visible difficulty, that she had allowed her own fears about tradition and social standing to overshadow her responsibility as a mother to support her son during one of the most important moments of his life. The conversation was not simple or entirely resolved by a single apology. Alexander made clear that while he appreciated his mother's willingness to acknowledge her mistake, rebuilding trust would take considerably longer than a single conversation could accomplish. Constance accepted this without argument, and over the following months, she made gradual, genuine efforts to build a relationship with Alina as well, efforts that Alina met with cautious but open willingness, understanding that meaningful change often required patience on both sides. Alexander's father remained more distant throughout this process, though he did eventually send a brief letter acknowledging that his silence during the difficult period surrounding the wedding had been a failure on his part, one he regretted more than he had initially been willing to admit. The relationship between Alexander and his father remained complicated, marked by long-standing patterns of formality and emotional distance that predated even the accident. But small, tentative steps toward reconciliation began appearing over time. Edward, whose loyalty during the wedding had never wavered, found himself drawn even closer into Alexander and Alina's life following the ceremony. He became a regular presence at the estate, helping Alexander navigate the complicated task of rebuilding relationships with extended family members, while also supporting the practical changes being made throughout the property. His steady, unwavering support during the most difficult period of Alexander's life had cemented a bond between the cousins that neither of them took for granted. Margaret continued her role at the estate, though her position seemed to shift subtly following the wedding, from simply a long-time employee to something closer to a trusted family confidant. She often spoke fondly of the wedding day itself, telling anyone who would listen about the image of Alina walking alone through those chapel doors, smiling despite everything working against her, describing it as the most genuine display of love she had witnessed in her many decades working for noble families throughout the county. A year after the wedding, Alexander and Alina welcomed their first child, a daughter they named after Alina's grandmother, a small but meaningful gesture that honored Alina's family background within the traditionally aristocratic naming customs of the Whitmore family. The birth of their daughter brought even more of the extended family back into closer contact, curiosity and affection for the new addition, softening some of the remaining tension that had lingered since the wedding. Throughout it all, Alina continued her advocacy work, eventually helping establish a foundation focused specifically on supporting couples navigating relationships affected by disability, drawing on both her professional expertise and her own deeply personal experience. The foundation grew steadily over the following years, offering counseling resources, community support groups, and educational programs aimed at challenging outdated assumptions about love, partnership, and physical ability. Alexander, for his part, became an outspoken advocate for accessibility improvements throughout the county, using his position and resources to fund infrastructure changes that made public spaces, transportation, and community buildings more accommodating for people with mobility challenges. He often spoke publicly about his own journey, from the isolation and self-doubt that consumed him in the years immediately following his accident, to the confidence and purpose he eventually rebuilt with Alina's steady support beside him. Looking back years later, neither Alexander nor Alina described their wedding day as a tragedy, despite the empty chapel and the painful absence of so many people who should have been present to celebrate with them. Instead, they spoke of it as the moment that revealed, with absolute clarity, exactly who truly belonged in their lives moving forward. The people who stayed away had, in their absence, given Alexander and Alina an unmistakable answer about where genuine loyalty and love could actually be found. On quiet evenings, sitting together in the estate gardens where Alexander had first proposed, they sometimes reflected on that snowy morning, on the empty benches and the echoing footsteps, on the moment Alina appeared alone at the chapel doors, smiling despite every reasonable expectation that she might not come at all. It had been, they both agreed, the truest test of everything they had built together. And it was a test that had ultimately proven their love far stronger and more resilient than either of them had dared to hope during the darkest days following Alexander's accident. Their story continued to inspire others long after the initial newspaper coverage faded from public attention, a quiet reminder that genuine love rarely depends on approval, tradition, or the number of people willing to witness it, but instead on the simple, unwavering choice of two people determined to build a life together, regardless of who chooses to stand beside them, and regardless of every empty seat left behind by those who never truly understood what they were missing.